Behind me lies the spectacular Pismo Dunes ecosystem, one of the most fragile and sensitive environments on the planet. In fact, according to the National Park Service, it's more valuable environmentally than Yosemite Valley. Yet we allow off-road vehicles to desecrate and destroy this sensitive environment annually. Would we allow off-road vehicles to destroy Yosemite Valley? Of course not. Why do we allow this at Pismo?
The Nipomo Dunes are a stamp of geologic time, representing nearly 1 million years of sand accumulation from riverbeds and longshore currents, shifting and shaping from prevailing winds, and sea level fluctuations from glacial cooling and melting. Their existence is also locational, requiring a rare combination of elements that make coastal dunes possible.
There are very few places along the coast where coastal dunes form. They have to be in the right configuration of coast, usually a coastline that faces towards the northwest, and one with a headland to the south, so that the sand can't drift around the headland and go off down to San Diego or someplace. As a result, we have little patches of sand in just a few areas. Each one has evolved their own particular group of species. Things like the Morrow blue butterfly, for example, which lives on the lupins that we see around here. These are only known from right here and from Morrow Bay. They are what we call sensitive species. There are many of those here.
These rare local plants and animals are called endemic species, or species unique to a particular region. Their abundance in the Nipomo Dunes make up the highest endemism of any dune area in western North America, deeming the health of this system vital to both local and global species diversity. The dunes owe their rare biologic vitality to various subsystems that exist here. Freshwater lakes and wetlands like Oso Flaco lakes are habitat to rare and endangered plants and hundreds of bird species. Watersheds like Arroyo Grande Creek are prime habitat for steelhead trout. And beach and back beach environments are critical habitat for the threatened western snowy plover and California least tern, who live among other shorebirds. All of these habitats coexist within the precious Nipomo Dunes ecosystem.
It is not a riverine ecosystem, it is not an upland mountain ecosystem, it's not a beach ecosystem, it's an ecosystem unto itself. And it contains its own web of life, and that of course contains a vast web of genetic information we know very little about. We've decoded the genes of just a few things so far. We have no idea really about what all this means to us. It's a resource. It's a resource we should hang on to.
A task easier said than done. Regardless of their significance, their sensitivity, and their habitat to rare and endangered species, off-highway vehicles still frequent the Oceano Nipomo Dunes, and on busy holiday weekends, frequent is an understatement. Up to 10,000 vehicles blanket the beach and dunes on peak weekends, coining the Oceano Dunes SVRA, one of the most damaging uses of coastal resources in all of California. Impacts to sensitive habitats and endangered species in the SVRA have not yet been quantified. Why? Because comprehensive environmental review has never taken place. The impacts are evident though, studies or no studies. Of primary concern are vehicle impacts to the federally listed threatened western snowy plover, whose numbers in California are fading fast.
In the year 2000, a statewide census of snowy plovers along the California coast was conducted, and we found that the population now numbers less than 1,000 individual birds. When we compare these numbers to the previous census taken in 1995, we find that the population has decreased nearly 1/3 in only 5 years.
The SVRA is critical habitat for these shorebirds, who spend most of their reproductive cycle in the barren riding area. To make matters worse, plover nesting season coincides with 3 out of 4 major holidays, proliferating their common demise. Loss of nesting habitat. If you were a snowy plover, would you nest here? Would you feed here? Doubtful. While sister agencies require state parks to fence plover nests on site, this by no means ensures chick survival. The reason? Plover chicks are precocial and must actively search for food within 2 hours of birth. To eat, flightless plover chicks must leave the nest and protective exclosures to feed on the high tide line or rack line, otherwise known in the SVRA as the highway.
Chicks are also subject to increased risk because they are mobile and running around and seeking food for the first 30 days of life when they're flightless. And at that point on the SVRA, they are subject to being run over. There's probably a reduced risk to nests, but a higher risk to the young.
Arroyo Grande Creek, a mandatory crossing to reach the riding area, is also critical spawning habitat for steelhead trout. Despite over 1 million creek crossings every year, reports from trust agencies state that this activity would not adversely affect steelhead spawning. Phil Ashley, fisheries expert, believes the contrary.
Where the vehicles are crossing the creek, right in the surf, the turbidity is the greatest. It combines the turbidity of the creek, but then the wave action on the sand creates even more turbidity, so the steelhead would not be able to see the vehicles moving back and forth through the creek, and that could be a significant adverse impact to them. And for a threatened species, where we have very few species spawners in any given small creek like this, every individual fish is important.
Beyond endangered species, OHVs devastate the dune structure, and in turn, surrounding dune lakes and plant communities.
The dunes advance because there is available sand. When an off-road vehicle drives across open sand, it breaks the sand surface and exposes the sand for more easy excavation in the winds. The more vehicles you have, the more sand disturbance of the dune surface, the more sand is produced.
Over time, vehicles have completely destroyed the foredunes in the riding area, which would otherwise be habitat to rare dune vegetation and the first line of defense from wind and sand erosion. Just south of the riding area, even the casual observer will notice a stark contrast between rehabilitating foredunes, now off limits to vehicles, and flat wastelands in the SVRA.
Off-road vehicles loved the foredunes because they were bumps right off the beach, and what they have done, of course, in driving through the wind gaps, which were natural gaps between these, opened up the wind gaps, the vegetation has been killed, the sand is blown away, and eventually the plants in the dunes become undermined and die off, and the entire foredune disappears.
While vehicle impacts are obvious in the Oceano dunes, equitable regulation by trust agencies has been far less apparent. Meet Tony Kaiser, a fiber optic cable contractor regulated and monitored by 17 different agencies for a landing at the northern entrance to the SVRA. Tony's cable landing, like all other potentially damaging projects, was thoroughly reviewed, regulated, and monitored before it was allowed to proceed. In the SVRA, however, the same agencies have allowed vehicles to proceed free of environmental review for nearly 2 decades, despite legal mandates to conduct these studies.
I find it disconcerting that I've been so regulated, which I believe in, because it helps me successfully complete a project while simultaneously protecting the environment and the people that are interested in this area. But immediately adjacent, I have I've seen these people have free reign of the beach, doing more damage in 1 day than I've done here in 3 months. But I feel that if we need to regulate these beaches to protect them from a construction point of view, then we need to spread that responsibility to everybody, so the beach will be here for all of us and generations to come.
In 1982, the California legislature mandated state parks to actively manage the SVRA. They also required a carrying capacity study to include comprehensive environmental review in its findings. State Parks has yet to conduct environmental review, a reality reflected by daily vehicle limits, which haven't changed since 1975, a time when circumstances were very different.
In the nearly 20 years since this park was created, a lot has happened. The riding area has been reduced from 17 miles to 5 miles of beach. The western snowy plover has been listed as an endangered species. The California least tern has become a fully protected bird under California state law. Steelhead trout have become a listed threatened species. But what hasn't changed in the nearly 20 years is that we still need environmental review, comprehensive environmental review, and State Parks still wants to run 4,300 vehicles per day while it's conducting those studies.
Today, agencies face the task of gauging environmental impacts in the SVRA with no baseline account of non-vehicular use to compare to. Instead of logically closing the park to conduct essential baseline studies, they propose a regimen of adaptive management under the advice and oversight of a technical review team. The review team would be composed of stakeholders, a majority who've historically supported OHVs, and the same trust agencies who allowed this for 18 years without even a blink.
There needs to be a separate scientific committee. If you look at that really can give us the science, that's independent. It should make all of the decisions about the kinds of studies that should be had and about the interpretation of those studies. Those interpretations of the studies themselves should not be subject to stakeholders who have an interest. Those studies need to be good science.
If we're to protect least terns and snowy plovers at Pismo, we have to invoke and require some reasonable limitations on the activities occurring here. There is no better example for the appropriate procedures than Lompoc Beach, just 20 miles away, where the Commission just 6 months ago prohibited even pedestrian access.
This past season looks like there were 70 some odd nests that hatched and less than 10 where there was fledgling success. That's not a rate that allows this species to survive. At Vandenberg this same year, they had a 31% fledgling success.
A year and a half ago, amidst great concern among Coastal Commission members, State Parks was urged to take immediate action to protect snowy plovers and other endangered species at Oceano. Let's review where we've been. State Parks has formed committees.
One of the first things the TRC should do is to identify what studies need to be done, and I can't understand why we don't know that by now.
Held hearings.
The birds are not being unprotected.
Conducted workshops.
Fact is, we don't have infinite time.
Engaged in studies.
It's really hard to go back, if no studies had ever been done, to know what might have been.
Thank you. Staff.
But not one car has been removed from the beach.
Right now, we're losing the war.
Over 1 million visitors and hundreds of thousands of cars are being driven annually on this beach without any reduction whatsoever.
Wheels going round again.
At the same time, we have a horrific death toll for the snowy plover.
Wheels going round again.
Let's do the obvious, easy thing. Let's remove the cars from the beach.
Despite measures taken by the Coastal Commission in 2001, there is still something very wrong in the Oceano dunes. It's clear nothing's gotten better here. In fact, things have only gotten worse. If one thing has improved, it's our understanding that time is a luxury we no longer have. Regulatory measures are failing, studies backward, and the birds are feeling it.
The 2001 snowy plover breeding season here at Oceano Dunes was an unmitigated disaster and helps explain why the snowy plover is on the verge of extinction. Of 68 snowy plovers hatched here in the riding area, 66 were dead within days and only 2 lived to fly away.
Your own opinion states that there are no more than 976 of these plovers left, down dramatically. Extinction is forever. If you take too long, it won't make any difference.
Oh, I certainly know that.
There's like 3 things I would never do. I'd never carry a clock radio into my bathtub. I'd never pick a fight with Steve Austin, and I'd never drive a truck through a child's nursery. And if we don't reduce the number of vehicles that go through that park, that's exactly what we're doing. We're allowing trucks to be driven through the nurseries of these species.
Commissioners, it's simple. No amount of technical expertise, studies, meetings, workshops, and what have you is going to ever lead to the conclusion that having snowy plovers in the back of a beach highway is good for them. Snowy plovers and dune buggies are incompatible. They're incompatible here at Oceano, they'd be incompatible anywhere. Those snowy plovers depend upon this beach for their survival, and until those cars are moved to the back of the dunes or off the beach, the snowy plovers will continue to be in peril.
If what you're coming to tell me is that it may be a fiction that these particular uses have impacts with respect to these species during sensitive periods, and in particular during the spawning period, you probably don't want to tell me that. You know, going through the stream during a certain period of time is probably bad. It's probably also pretty obvious that, you know, when the birds are hatching, you know, that would be a good time to expand the area of protection. I mean, I'm not talking rocket science here.
So let's see what we've accomplished. State parks begrudgingly established these meager exclosures for plovers, and a technical review team was established. And now, a year later, what does the technical review team recommend? They recommend smaller protected areas for the plovers so that not so many of them will even hatch. The theory being that if less plovers hatch here, less plovers will die here. Well, with that kind of reasoning, we should extinguish all of nature, lest wildlife break out.
These studies, I mean, when I've done massive or big projects like this, I've had the whole studies done. You worked with Fish and Wildlife, Fish and Game, and everybody else, and had them done in 6 months. And yet, as a private developer, I'm forced to do this. Then I hear from these state agencies that takes years, and this has been going on for 20 years. I'm appalled. You know, something's got to change here.
Despite what I consider to be unbelievably dramatic degradation happening on these dunes, directly in contravention to the purposes of the Coastal Act and our duty as coastal commissioners. I don't think it's too much to ask for a moratorium for 10 months or a year, however long it is required, because the off-road vehicles have had the use of this area for a very long time.
What you're sensing here is tremendous frustration on the part of this commission as a result of 20 years of refusal to deal with this in a meaningful way.
The only thing that would be unjustified for this commission, the only thing indeed that would be inexcusable, is to continue to do nothing, to continue to rely on state parks, which has steadfastly refused to address the protection of the snowy plover. We're asking you, we're urging you to remove the cars off the beach. There's thousands of acres of inland dune habitat here that may well be appropriate for off-road vehicle recreation. The beach is the area where we know it's inappropriate. So commissioners, is what we're doing working? We think not. We think dramatic new measures are necessary to ensure the survival of the snowy plovers. First and foremost among those measures is removing the off-road vehicles from the beach at Oceano. That one step, that single management measure, will have more effect benefiting plovers than all of the technical review teams, the studies, the meetings, the workshops, all of the talk. Commissioners, talk is cheap. What we're asking you to do is take action on the ground here at Oceano to ensure that the off-road vehicles are not on the beach during the next snowy plover breeding season.
We stand at a crossroads in the Oceano-Nipomo dunes, faced with an opportunity to begin giving back to this ecosystem what we've taken for so long. Just look at this place. It is a wonder of nature that reaches far beyond our comprehension. In managing this vast resource, we must stop and ask ourselves, does the dollar and special interest hold priority over life? Our environmental laws tell us it doesn't. And in the Oceano dunes, it's time we began listening. If not for ourselves, for the species here, who have not the capacity to adapt as we do. We, as man, have the ability to reason, the tools to create, the power to change. Today is a day to apply these natural gifts and to restore the gift that is the Oceano Nipomo dunes.
Well, a perfect world for a naturalist, of course, would be what we see in this area here, which is nature, something living, something to study, something to cherish. A perfect world for an off-road vehicle person, I guess, would be an endless, infinite expanse of off-road vehicle open area. If I was asked to bring them together, I would say, okay, give a little more on the dunes. Certainly block off where the foredunes used to be and where the birds are, and keep vehicles off that and keep them off it all the time, and so that the birds fledge and the flowers bloom again, and then let the off-road vehicles go or continue in on the areas to the rear, which would most likely in a normal dune environment be bare sand.